What next for the Rwanda policy? Should we give tax breaks to landlords? And could MPs face sanctions for comments made about the Privileges Committee? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Kieran Mullen, Labour peer Baroness Anderson, the founder of Conservative Home Tim Montgomery, and Politico's Rosa Prince. Today, the Court of Appeal rules that the government's Rwanda plan is unlawful.
There is a real risk that persons sent to Rwanda will be returned to their home countries. In that sense, Rwanda is not a safe third country.
So will the planes ever get off the ground? The policies also hit the buffers in the Lords.
There have voted content 222, not content 179. The contents have it.
So what's the bigger headache for the Prime Minister, the Lords or the courts?
Are you one of those who would describe it as a kangaroo court?
I think you're being very rude to marsupials. I think it makes kangaroo courts look respectable.
Should MPs who made comments like that be sanctioned by Parliament?
To live in disrepair for 2 years, to be asked for more money and then to complain and to be evicted was just devastating.
The government is legislating to protect renters. But we'll speak to one landlord who thinks the new rules will backfire. And we start today with that news from the Court of Appeal breaking this morning. The court has ruled that the UK-Rwanda asylum plan is unlawful. The court's decision found that Rwanda could not be deemed a safe third country, as there was a risk that asylum seekers could be sent back to their home countries, and that changes for the policy had to be put forward. So I suppose the question is, Kieran, is this policy ever going to take off? Will it ever work?
Well, I think the first thing to say is clearly this is a priority for the government because it's a priority of my constituents and people across the country.
But is it going to actually happen?
And so I think we have to recognise, first of all, that this is a finely balanced issue. And actually, of the three judges that gave this ruling today, the most senior agreed that it was lawful. And so I would expect the government will appeal quite rightly. And I think it really came down to whether the government was reasonable to think that Rwanda, under this agreement, could safely accommodate asylum seekers. And I think it can, and there's lots of evidence that it can. And in fact, the UNHCR, who's one of the parties saying they can't, are happy for them to resettle refugees there in other circumstances. So I'm curious as to why they have a split opinion. The government, I think, is determined to deliver this policy because it's so important. There are lots of things that we are doing when it comes to agreements with France, agreements with Albania, prosecuting the criminal gangs, but ultimately I think a deterrent, which is what Labour aren't offering, a deterrent for people to say, you know, you can't come here, you can't decide how you get here, is so important that we've got to pursue it.
There is, of course, the prospect of the appeal, which you mentioned, but are we going to actually see planes take off? Will it happen this year?
I hope that we do. It's important that we deliver on that programme because otherwise what you have is a system where not only do criminal gangs profit from the misery of people making that channel crossing, but what we're leaving behind are the people who can't make that channel crossing physically, they're not up to it, or they can't afford to pay the people smugglers. At the moment, we're letting the people smugglers determine our immigration policy when it comes to asylum. It shouldn't be that way, and I think the key way to stop that is to say if you come through an illegal route, you don't get to stay.
OK,
that's a noble aim.
I think what this demonstrates is a government without a plan on actually how to deal with immigration, and the one idea they had is unravelling. And on a personal level, I find the Rwanda scheme completely immoral. But what this has proved is it's also illegal. So the government's going to have to come up with a new plan, and we're going to have to move beyond rhetoric, beyond the phrase "stop the boats." My family came here on boats. No one wants to see what we're seeing. We need to figure out a different way of dealing with our immigration policy, but it has to be more coherent and actually effective than spending £140 million on a scheme so far that has benefited nobody, including your constituents, my former constituents, and the rest of the country.
Tim, whatever the sort of moral arguments about this, in a practical sense, are we ever going to see planes taking off and taking, you know, asylum seekers to Rwanda?
I'm beginning to doubt it. And I support the policy. I don't agree with Ruth about the morality of the policy. And I think there'll be a lot of British people who think, well, I feel less safe in Britain because we don't have control of our borders. I feel unsafe because we have illegal immigrants coming in. The history of them, you know, we do not know, but a lot of them get involved in drug gangs and other illegal activities when they are here. And a lot of people will be wondering about the courts and saying, you seem very interested in the welfare of migrants, and that is proper, but where is your interest in the welfare of the British people? And I think it raises big questions, really, about the power of the courts in our country when they can consistently undermine the democratically elected representatives of this country. In America, they have a system whereby, you know, the people who are appointed to courts have become politicised.
Well,
and that is the danger that court decisions like those of today are exposing us to. The only way of dealing with it may be for us to go, which I would not want ideally to choose, to go down the American road of having to politicise our court appointments, because that's the only way the democracies get the upper hand again.
Although I think the court was at pains today to point out that it wasn't making a moral judgment on the policy one way or the other. It was just saying it's not lawful.
But the effect, as your question at the beginning implies, is it stopping the democratically elected government doing what it wants to do, and has made it clear over a number of years that it wants to do.
Rosa, government's stuck now.
They are stuck. I mean, I think that the ruling today is largely unhelpful for the government because it's obviously thwarting them in this measure that they're very keen to see brought forward. It's one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges to stop the boats. This is the kind of flagship aspect of that. It's the deterrent that Kieran was talking about. On the other hand, I think that Tim's rhetoric is really interesting because as this scheme gets delayed with further court wrangles, we're probably not looking towards any flights taking off till very close to a general election. And I wonder if this will become the line that Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman start to take, that it's the courts thwarting them, that it's the House of Lords, which we're going to talk about, holding them up, and kind of trying to blame the issue on the blob rather than anything else.
Not unreasonably, to be fair.
Well, I wonder if that is the point, because politically, does it work anyway? Because, as you say, you can refer to this blob, you know, the North London lawyers kind of... Does that...
Look, if Jesus Christ returns to earth today and, put the theology aside, becomes leader of the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party, I think, is doomed at the next election. There's nothing the Conservative Party can do to change its electoral trajectory. But I think it's about... I think this is, nonetheless, a card that the Conservative Party will play, and I think it will strike many people as reasonable, but it's not going to turn the Conservative Party's fortunes around, and I think the party leadership recognises it.
I don't think the Prime Minister ever thought this was going to be an easy thing to do, but he didn't shy away from setting it out as a clear priority because it's what people want us to deliver on. And when it comes to the election, it will be a clear choice. A party, you know, whether we've struggled to get it over the line, but at least we're determined to deliver this policy in spite of the kind of rhetoric we've heard about it being immoral, when actually the vast majority of people think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, or a Labour Party that just dances around the issue and won't say one way or the other. Actually, should people be able to decide for themselves whether we give them asylum? Because that's what's happening at the minute. We should decide who we give asylum to, not the people.
OK, let's stick with the theme of migration there. Can we just see now the front of the Daily Express? Don't you dare block boats bill. This is referring to the House of Lords. There are a number of defeats last night for the government on the illegal migration bill, which amongst them would be one of the amendments would backdate new deportation powers to March this year. There are a number of others in there as well. Kieran, would you say that the House of Lords is trying to block this bill?
Well, quite clearly. I mean, they're voting.
I mean, clearly the Daily Express thinks it is. But
largely, you know, led by Labour peers. They're just not signed up to what the British people want us to do, which is to get control of illegal migration. And not only is it something the British people want, it's the morally correct thing to do. We should not be saying to, you know, a grandma in a wheelchair in a refugee camp in bordering Syria that she can't get asylum here because actually our system is overwhelmed by young men who are crossing in small boats. That's what it boils down to. What choice do you want to make? And they say, well, let's use safe and legal routes. Ultimately, if you made it even easier for some people to get here, we'd have even more claims, the system would be even more overwhelmed. We have to set a limit, we have to control who comes, and that's the fair and compassionate thing to do.
I'd love the idea that there is a grandma sitting here trying to get through on a legal route because there aren't any.
No, because we're overwhelmed.
No, excuse me, I didn't interrupt you.
Sure.
But there aren't any. There aren't any for the women that we left in Afghanistan. There aren't any for the people that worked with our forces that we left out. We've left thousands of people who have a relationship with us abandoned. There's also only 1% of the people that arrived here by illegal boats last year have been dealt with in terms of their cases. The backlog is worse than it has been at any point in the last 13 years, not comparing to anything that has happened before, this is an incompetent and ineffective government that can't even deal with paperwork. But in terms of the House of Lords and what happened yesterday, the idea it was Labour Lords, there was one Labour amendment we voted on yesterday, and it was Alf Dubs' amendment to protect children. And if you're saying that that isn't what we should be doing, then I don't understand why you're in politics. The other amendments came from crossbenchers, and the House of Lords is doing its job. Line-by-line scrutiny of a piece of legislation that we do on every single piece of legislation.
It's not frustrating the will of the elected government?
It's absolutely not. We're doing exactly what we're meant to do. A piece of legislation is in front of us. We are not voting it down. What we're doing is adding amendments. There were former judges that were speaking last night to say what will work and what won't work in terms of the legal framework. Alf Dubs was talking about children. We've had bishops intervene about how they think the morality of this works, but also the practicalities of this will work. No one is trying to block the bill. What we're trying to do is make it
It's really important to pick up on this,
unreasonable.
because you're absolutely right to say that at the moment there aren't large numbers of people coming through unsafe and legal routes. But of course there's absolutely no appetite politically. What government, Labour or otherwise, would be able to say to the British people when we have 50,000 odd people coming through on boats, or on top of that we want to let in another 20,000 people on safe and legal routes? You don't build the public support for safe and legal routes until you control the illegal migration.
Given the ruling of the courts today, will the bill actually make any difference?
So my understanding is we can do this under existing legislation. The ruling today is about whether or not the government was reasonable to assume that it could safely have people process their asylum claims in Rwanda. And I'll just emphasise again that one of the three judges, the most senior of the three, thought that we could do that. And so, I think it shows you how finely balanced this issue is. And actually, if you read the judgment of the judge who led the opposing opinion and said we couldn't, he himself said he vacillated on it and recognised how finely balanced it was. So let's not overstate the scale of the problem. I think I would imagine that the government can go further on the assurances it sought from Rwanda to further shore up its case that it can move people there safely.
OK, Tim, you said you were frustrated by the courts. I imagine you're equally frustrated by the behaviour of the Lords.
I am. I think there's always legitimacy to some of the things that the Lords put forward. But I think the challenge for the Labour Party, the challenge for the opposition is, we had a net immigration last year into the country of 600,000 people. And it's clear that the Conservative Party is struggling to control the numbers we already have. 600,000 is already, in the view of the British people, far too many. It's not what they voted for when they voted for Brexit 7 years ago. And the question for the Labour Party really is, you've always got a good reason to oppose the controls that the Conservative Party are trying to put in. But you never seem to have a policy to actually bring numbers under control, because if we don't bring numbers under control, other problems that we regularly talk about on programmes like this, like the rising cost of housing, pressure on public services, will continue to grow. And so Labour are at the moment, being quite an effective opposition, but if they want to be the party of government, then they have to start bringing solutions to the problems that the British people face.
Tim, I think you're being completely disingenuous. You know that Yvette Cooper's got a clear plan. You know
I really
that it is about... No, but there is a clear plan, and it's about dealing with the backlog. It's about securing our borders, and then it's about choosing who we want to be here. We never had 600,000 immigrant figures in terms of net migration when Labour were in power. Yes, we had Brexit. That's a completely different conversation. We never had this level of I don't want to use the word uncontrolled immigration, but this is a government who don't seem to know how to control their own borders. The Labour Party's got a clear plan for that, and whether it is stronger relationships with our European partners, which are key, but also about how we invest in the backlog of cases so we can deal with the people who are here, who should be here, or send people home if they shouldn't be. It's being fair and pragmatic, as we always have been as a country, and I don't understand why we've moved on to this level of rhetoric.
Keir Starmer wanted free movement. Keir Starmer wanted free movement.
Keir Starmer says absolutely not to free movement.
No, he originally said that, and like everything, he flip-flops. He has one position one time, another position another time.
And the world has moved on from Brexit. And candidly, look at the polls. You need to move on from those arguments because they're getting you nowhere.
No, I think they demonstrate that he's not reliable and you can't trust what he says.
Oh my God, look at Rishi. You've had Rishi who seemingly can't agree or get anything through. You've had Liz Truss, who has created a mortgage bombshell that the rest of us will be living through forever, that is costing your constituents thousands and thousands of pounds. You have undermined and destroyed nearly every public service. We've got everyone on strike, and you've got the audacity to attack
There's so many issues there I would like to come back on.
Rosa, can I ask you, this is interesting, because we said before, you mentioned before, Rishi Sunak has made this one of his 5 pledges. Are we now gearing up for a kind of ongoing running battle before we hit recess in the summer between the Lords And the
between
government.
the Lords and the government, certainly. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of the opposition to the government's policy programme is coming from the Lords. People talk about walking along the street outside here, right past the Houses of Parliament, and the lights are on at the end of the Lords and not much really happening in the Commons. Going back to the Rwanda scheme, we haven't really discussed something that happened earlier this week, which is the Home Office costing of how much it's going to cost. It's £163,000 per person, I think.
169. It's 63,000 more than the current cost.
Exactly. I think that I'm not a pollster, but my sort of instinct would be that the public does feel quite strongly about illegal immigration and is unhappy about it, but is less certain about the Rwanda scheme, particularly now that they know quite how much it costs and whether that is a cost-effective way of dealing with it. So I think that will become something.
Let's be clear, though, about talking about the cost. The cost already of putting these illegal immigrants up in hotels and accommodation, which British people can't afford to stay in, is already enormous. The cost of the Rwanda policy is very controversial because, yes, deporting individual people is very expensive, but if it works as a deterrent, then the cost factors, as the Home Office report acknowledged.
Yeah, the Home Office report said that you'd need to hit a deterrent point of around 40%.
Yeah.
It's unclear as to how, that...
But the cost starts coming down if the deterrent effect
the cost
really
of
is
doing
quite
nothing
strong.
is much, much higher than that, something like £13 million a year if we don't deal with it. It's going to take 2 people to be deterred for every person that we send to Rwanda for it to be cost effective, and I'd be ambitious that we can do that. Well, we look at Albania, for example, where we've seen a 90% drop in people coming over.
But without Rwanda.
Now that we have agreed to send people back to Albania.
Isn't that more about the agreement with the Albanians?
Yeah, that's about effective policy.
Australia stopped the boats with a very similar policy. This is the model. Australia policy works. Unfortunately, we have a court system in here that doesn't allow us to have the kind of policy that protected Australia's borders. OK,
all right, well, we're sort of sticking with this now. One of the things that was referenced by the court this morning was an intervention by the European Court of Human Rights, the EHCR. Let's have a look at the front of the Times. Here we go. Dominic Raab rages as Bill of Rights is binned for good. Alex Chalk shelves plans introduced by predecessor as Justice Secretary. This is a story from earlier in the week. So this is the plans for a UK Bill of Rights, which would kind of weaken the powers of the ECHR in some instances, particularly relating to migration. Do you think the government need to think again on this? What do you think of the idea of dropping the Bill of Rights?
Committee, so we went through the proposals in quite some detail. I think it was clear to me that whilst I still think there is a potential on occasions for the court to overreach, and you see in many other EU countries they have mechanisms to reduce that. In recent years, there hasn't been quite the same overreach, and I understand, why the government doesn't have this as a top priority. We know the government's 5 priorities are growing the economy, halving inflation, reducing debt, getting down waiting lists.
OK. Yeah. All 5. Well done, Kieran.
Yeah, so I understand why it's not a priority. I mean, I do think cases like this, in theory, might get people thinking again. But as I said, this judgment wasn't really about anything to do with the human rights in a sense. It was about whether our assurances that their rights were going to be protected were sufficient. So I don't see this as an immediate clash with the European Court of Human Rights approach. But the courts, the courts do need, as they often are, need to be mindful of the sovereignty of countries, and it's a back and forth over many years. There was a period, the prisoner votes might be the thing that people remember, where they clearly overreached, and they've stepped back in recent years, and we saw that in the evidence for making the case for these proposals. So I understand why it's not a priority, but it shouldn't be that we're vulnerable to a change in mood at the court, and we should take some of the steps that other EU countries take to limit the power of the courts when appropriate.
OK, Ruth, are you relieved to see the Bill of the English Bill of Rights drift away into the...
I think the Human Rights Act is one of the most important legacies from the last Labour government. I'm very proud of it. I run a human rights organisation in my real life, where I publish the work of political dissidents, and they're protected by their right to freedom of expression as protected under our Human Rights Act. So I am very partial to this piece of legislation. I think it's an incredibly important thing. Everything always needs review. Nothing should ever be set in stone. But we've seen, but the idea of a Bill of Rights, when we have seen such an inconsistent approach to this government, to their application of many pieces of legislation, just seemed perverse to me. And there are other more important things to do when people are struggling to pay their bills.
OK, Tim. It seems as though this is Rishi Sunak. He's charting a direction here.
Is he?
Well, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. It would appear.
It feels slightly academic to me, really, because we've run out of time in this Parliament. What Rosa said a little while ago about the lights in the House of Commons always being off and the lights on the House of Lords always being on. The great tragedy for me as a Conservative supporter is, we're now, 3-4 years into the Parliament. There's not much time to really pass substantive legislation. The waste of this parliamentary session. We won a majority of 80, and we have done so little with it. And this is the sort of reform, if you're going to do it, you get on with it straight away. And I don't accept that the pandemic was an excuse. Beveridge wrote his report for the reform of the welfare state during World War II. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's the failure, really, of the Conservatives to prioritise big reforms early in the Parliament, and it's academic to be talk about, dumping them at this stage because we've run out of time.
Well, so it's a time issue, but the Bill of Rights, in your view, would have made it easier for the government to effectively.
Yeah, I would have supported it, if it had been done properly, and I'd hope we would have been able to deal with some of your concerns about whether it was diluting the Human Rights Act in certain ways. But the vote for Brexit 7 years ago was a vote really for our democratic institutions to have more supremacy. People wanted to have a connection between their vote and delivery of policy. And total Brexit, to use the expression of David Frost, would have involved not just leaving the European Union, but reforming our, the various forms of legal.
You mentioned that. I mean, Lord Frost said that in a speech this week. This idea of total Brexit.
Yeah.
But he would like to have a he gave Lord Frost a speech earlier this week, said that we should have a referendum on leaving the ECHR. Does anyone have appetite for that?
No. I think if we're looking ahead, I think this might be some of the battlegrounds that start to come up after the election. If there's a Conservative minority, if they lose the election and go into opposition, it's going to be interesting to see who's still around and who's fighting those battles. And people like Suella Braverman, like David Frost, who's in the Lords, I think they might begin to make the case that we should be leaving Strasbourg, going it alone, having a British Bill of Rights. So it's kind of parked for now. I think it's interesting that Rishi Sunak seems to be, as you described it, kind of walking quite a narrow line. He does want to remain within international law. He's a bit uncomfortable with the idea that we would totally depart from Europe and the court. But I think he gets close. I think he kind of wants to push the boundaries, but not quite go over the line.
OK. What do you think make of that idea of a referendum on the European?
I think government by referenda is completely contrary to our democratic life. We elect politicians to represent us, and we've had enough referenda over the last 10 years. Thanks.
Kieran?
I think it's reform. I think there's room for reform. I'm not sure we need to, go as far as Lord Frost has suggested at this stage. But it is true to say that I think we historically have perhaps followed EU approaches to things, including the court rulings. I know they're separate bodies, but
to make it absolutely clear, they are completely
but I think
separate.
we've slavishly followed things when some of our European neighbours haven't, and that's where I think there is a space to reform.
The case for referenda is when all the politicians agree, but they're out of step with the public, which is what happened on the European Union. So although I largely agree with Ruth, sometimes you get that disconnection between the elected politicians and the people, and sometimes a referendum allows the people's voice to be heard in a way that
sometimes, but not anytime soon. OK, all right, we're going to move on now and talk about the Privileges Committee, which released its report this morning on the behaviour of some of the MPs during its inquiry into Boris Johnson. I'm very pleased to say now we're joined from our Westminster newsroom by our political correspondent Layla Nathu. Hey Layla, so can you talk us through what's happened?
Sure. Well, here it is, that report that you are referring to, a secondary report, really, quite small in comparison to that huge set of conclusions that the Privileges Committee published before as part of their original investigation into Boris Johnson over whether he misled Parliament over Partygate. Now, during the course of their inquiries, the committee says it was subjected to unprecedented and coordinated pressure, and its members were sort of attacked with the aim of trying to influence their conclusions and to discredit their inquiries. Essentially, they say there was a group of people out to undermine the committee's work, and they say, look, they weren't doing this formally or through any kind of proper engagement. They were essentially attacking the committee in public. And the committee says, look, our original investigation into Boris Johnson was so important because it was designed to protect the proper functioning of Parliament, ensuring that Parliament is not lied to by ministers. So now our work cannot be attacked and undermined because that itself, they say, is an attack on democracy. They talk about this pressure being put on the committee as having a significant personal impact on its individual members. And importantly, the committee today singles out what it calls the most disturbing examples of this coordinated campaign from key allies of Boris Johnson, people like Nadine Dorries, Priti Patel, Jacob Rees-Mogg, all former cabinet ministers, Lord Zach Goldsmith, who was a current minister in the government, and a handful of others who use terms, they say, like witch hunt, kangaroo court to describe that investigation into Boris Johnson. Now, we have heard from a few of the people who were mentioned who are criticising this report, so it doesn't look like at the moment it's had much effect in terms of changing their mind and how they approach this committee.
Yeah, so those individuals, as you say, have been named and shamed. What happens now?
Well, I mean, the committee says they wanted to publish this report basically to put on record their concerns about what happened during the investigation process. They don't actually recommend any particular sanction. They say it's going to be up to the House to decide if what further action, if any, should be taken. But there is going to be a debate on it a week on Monday. The government's already said it's going to make time for that. So there will be another parliamentary moment to discuss this particular set of conclusions. Both Labour and the Lib Dems are saying Lord Goldsmith should be sacked as a government minister. Really, this is just continuing fallout from that original investigation into Boris Johnson.
OK, thank you very much, Layla. That's great. Thanks for explaining that to us. Now, as Layla mentioned, there are a number of tweets in the annex of this report, which is really where a lot of the interesting reading is. We can have a look at some of them now from sort of staunch allies of Boris Johnson. Many of them Layla mentioned. This first one here from Nadine Dorries. You can see the final line there. It was a gross miscarriage of justice at the very least. And then next up, we see this one from Zach Goldsmith, which, as Layla said, he's currently a government minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He's retweeting, actually, the GB News presenter Dan Wootton. Dan Wootton's tweet originally said, the successful witch hunt against Boris Johnson has been absolutely appalling. Harriet Harman ran an anti-democratic kangaroo court. A terrible day for the Conservative Party and British democracy. Zach Goldsmith retweeting that and saying exactly this. And then we see another one here from Brendan Clark-Smith, who says, tonight we saw the end result of a parliamentary witch hunt, which would put a banana republic to shame. Those are just some of the tweets which were included in this report today. Is that OK, Kieran, that kind of language?
Not language I would have used, and I can understand why the committee wanted to put on record and make clear that they didn't think that was acceptable, and I'm sure the majority of the House didn't think that that was the way that we should go about things. I mean, they're slightly misplaced, I think, in talking about it being a court and seeking to hold it up to the standards of a court, because, of course, the Privileged Committee is not a court and never claimed to be a court. It's a group of your peers passing judgment on you. And those same people, some of them who are unhappy with how that would have worked, would be even more unhappy if there were to be another process involving not MPs passing judgment on us. So I think they're slightly misguided in their criticisms. Having said that, I think beyond putting it on record, which the committee has done, I wouldn't seek to say that people should be punished for expressing an opinion, and because actually, you know, it's free speech and they're entitled to say if they think it wasn't done properly. You
didn't vote in on the original report about Boris Johnson's behaviour. Why was that? And did you agree with the report?
I was one of the first people to say that Boris should resign because I didn't think his behaviour was acceptable. I do, in principle, support the Privileges Committee report. I was actually in Cornwall on a visit to a deep geothermal plant. It's something that I work on at a national level, not because I didn't want to support, and I've said publicly I do support them.
It's a good excuse to say you're at the bottom of a mine.
No, almost. At the top of a hot pipe.
Of a hot pipe, OK.
But I think, I mean, one of the reasons I decided to do the visit was actually because I think the public are frustrated with this sort of thing, you know, meaning that we're not getting on with the business of being MPs. And so that was part of me saying, look, actually, I've been asked to do something that's important to the work that I do both locally and at a national level. I want to get on and do that. If I felt that the report wasn't going to pass and there was a threat, then I would have perhaps prioritised being there to vote. But I was sure it was going to get through, and I'm happy to say that I would have supported it, because ultimately we asked a group of MPs to do a job on our behalf, and they did it. And as I said, I understand why some people didn't support it, but that's the process we have in Parliament, and I think you have to be careful criticising it.
And on this new motion, do you think there should be any sanctions?
No, I don't, as I said, I think it's quite right for the committee to say this wasn't acceptable behaviour and put it on the record, and others can join in that criticism. I think we'd perhaps going a bit too far if we were to sanction people for it, because, you know, where do you draw the line?
Tim?
I completely agree with everything that Kieran's just said, and I worry actually about a sort of a regulation of free speech. And I would have voted for the motion against Boris Johnson. I criticised my friend Nadine Dorries for some of the tweets that she said, and I tweeted why I disagreed with her. But she was exercising free speech. And perhaps you could say that some of the things that were said were, beyond a certain line. But if your Parliament starts regulating what MPs can say in debate, I worry about where that ends. And so I think it should end now. It's on the record that the Privilege Committee didn't like what was said about them. But let's not start, because my worry is that when this motion is put before Parliament, it will be amended by potentially the Labour Party, and we'll get sanctions on these MPs, and that will turn this into quite a bitter situation.
The committee said, though, that it wasn't the criticism itself; it was the nature of it. Some of it was very personal, the language that was used.
It was inappropriate, and I criticised that criticism. But once the committee starts regulating what MPs can say about other MPs in this way, I think that's a dangerous encroachment upon free speech. Just because we don't like things doesn't mean they should be banned or sanctioned.
We did approach many of those who were criticised in today's report. We haven't heard back from any of them so far. But we have got a tweet here from Mark Jenkinson. He says, they have literally just performed a Twitter search for terms they don't like and pasted them in a table. So he's clearly not very happy, is he, Rosa?
Well, that's right. You're probably not going to get that much disagreement, I think, around the table here, because we largely think that what they did was wrong, but that free speech is very important, particularly for parliamentarians. Yesterday, there was yet another report into Boris Johnson, which was from ACOBA, which is the body that you're meant to register your business interests with when you leave government, and he didn't do that because he took on this column with the Daily Mail before talking to them. And what the criticism largely was that Britain is a system that's run on called the good chap theory, and you're kind of meant to play by the rules, and there aren't really any sanctions if you break them. And I think this is yet another example of the good chap theory breaking down. So these parliamentarians shouldn't really have spoken in the terms that they did, and we don't so far seem to have come up with a way of dealing with that. I think most MPs that I speak to feel a bit queasy about the idea of limiting free speech. But what do you do? What do you do when someone doesn't abide by the rules?
Ruth?
I run a freedom of expression organisation, so of course I'm going to say they had the right to say whatever they wanted to. However, I love Parliament and I love British democracy, and I think we're so lucky to have it. And the issue that I have with what happened and people's responses to it, these specific responses to it is a dangerous road not to cherish and to protect the institutions that we have of our democracy. And some of these were clearly efforts to undermine what happens in that building. And I think that for someone who is elected or appointed to be part of our national democracy is an issue. I also think this is a problem for the Prime Minister as well. One of these people were his minister, and they speak on behalf of him, whether he likes it or not, and that has to be dealt with.
So do you think that, well, when you say dealt with, should there be sanctions then?
Well, I think we've got to see what the Prime Minister wants to do. Personally, obviously, Zac Goldsmith has the absolute right, and he's got parliamentary privilege, and he has a huge level of protection of his speech. However, he represents His Majesty's government, and I don't think that his language and what he did reflects his position well and reflects well on the government.
I agree with Ruth on that, actually. I think there shouldn't be a parliamentary sanction for the MPs that spoke, but there is a different responsibility for ministers. And I think Rishi Sunak generally, he's very carefully navigating all the time this division in the party between those who still back Boris and those don't. But I think what there is a hunger from the electorate, from a lot of conservatives like me, from him, is some leadership on a few issues. And actually sanctioning someone like Zac Goldsmith, who I have a lot of admiration for in other respects, but he shouldn't have sent that tweet. And I think that sets a standard about the kind of government ministerial conduct he expects.
Right, OK, well, watch this space. We'll see how that debate in the House of Commons goes next week. We're going to turn the corner now and talk a little bit about housing. Yesterday, the Labour Party called on the Conservatives to bring in urgent protections for renters as risks of evictions are on the rise. The government say they want to prioritise banning no-fault evictions, lengthening notice periods in cases of repossession, and a code of practice for letting agents to stamp out bad practice and ensure that renters are fairly treated. Let's speak now to Carolyn Uphill, who is a landlord and a former chair of the National Landlords Association. Lots of stuff going on at the moment to help renters. The government is actually, says it's taking action on this, although it does appear to be delayed. But what is the impact on people like you that rent out property, Carolyn?
Well, as you say, there's an awful lot going on. If we're talking about the Rental Reform Act, I'm a landlord of 20 years who lets in the private rented sector and to students. And for my private rented sector properties, I wouldn't be too worried about the new legislation if we had a working court system which acted in a timely manner when there was an actual problem, such as the landlord not receiving any rent. But at the moment, landlords can be waiting anything from 6 to 12 months for that court action while they're receiving no income whatsoever. So we're starting with a broken system, and the government has to fix that to give landlords confidence. Otherwise, they'll be completely risk averse to the tenants they will let in. On the other side of what I do, which is let to students, the rental reform proposals, as they stand at the moment, will be absolutely devastating. Because when you let to students, you let on an academic year basis. So you let on a fixed term tenancy in the knowledge that the students moving in for that 12 months will either be moving on or graduating at the end of it. And then you can plan ahead to let to the next cohort of students. So the next cohort, the first years in halls, can know they have somewhere to live. And the whole thing will break down with open-ended tenancies. The tenants will only have to give 2 months' notice, which should actually fall in the May when they're in the middle of exams. The tenants who are looking for accommodation would then have to be running around looking for accommodation in June. And there's already a shortage of accommodation in the student sector. Some universities were not able to accommodate them last year. But the biggest concern is that tenants could then either choose to leave just after 2 or 3 months or choose to stay on for an extra 2 or 3 months, which is great for the sitting tenants, but means that the landlord then ends up with an empty property at a point when it isn't the letting window to fit with the academic year.
And Carolyn,
so what does the landlord...
Sorry, there are a number of ways in which this potential legislation would be difficult for you. In a practical sense now, you and others, we know mortgage rates are going up. Does that mean that some private landlords are just looking to get out of the business because it's just becoming too difficult?
Absolutely. It's been death by 1,000 cuts with constant changes to regulation, changes to taxation. And I recently let a property in the private rented sector. And one of the questions I always ask is why are you moving? And so many of those looking for at my property were saying it's because my landlord is selling up. I've never experienced that before. I have friends in the business who are selling up. And I'm selling up. I've sold one of my student properties and I'm in the process of selling a second one because I don't see how that business will be viable. If I could just finish on that, what will happen is the landlord will end up with empty property outside the academic window. And unless he leaves it empty for months and months, which no landlord can afford to do, he'll take it out of the university system. He'll sell it, he'll let it to different tenants. And the universities will not then have anywhere to accommodate their students.
Stick with us, Carolyn. We'll try and come back to you. Kieran, are you worried about the impact of these new regulations? We're going to end up with private landlords just kind of coming out of the business and then even bigger shortage of private rental property.
Well, private landlords make up something like 4 million households in the UK. They're an important part of how people have a home in this country. But there is always a balance, of course, between the rights of landlords who can lawfully own a property and choose to rent it out, and naturally that we recognise as a society, if you're renting out a house, it's not like selling anything other things. It's a particular good, someone's home, and that there should be additional protections for you if you live in someone's home. And so I think what we're doing is bringing forward legislation that should hopefully help both, because I hear from landlords that think that the process for evicting tenants that are perhaps antisocial, for example, is too difficult, and so we're making that easier. But we're also bringing in the no-fault eviction ban, so that actually those tenants who are good tenants and who pay their rent, who perhaps want to complain about the services they get from the landlord, of which I also hear from my constituents, aren't at risk of being chucked out because they've raised a concern. And I recognise the point about the courts, and ever since the pandemic, you have to remember for a good period of time our courts were shut down. Inevitably, that we got them actually back into action faster than any other country, but there's still a backlog. So we've got extra sitting days, extra judges. We're doing what we can to address that, but we can't magic away that backlog that built up, which is another reason why I support the plans for the Ombudsman. So actually that we've got a strengthened Ombudsman who can perhaps deal with some of these things that don't need to go to court.
OK, Ruth.
I think one of the things that was so disappointing from last week's meeting that the Chancellor had with the banks was that there was no mention of the private rented sector and landlords. And interest rates are going up through the roof too, which is having a knock-on effect on rents by obvious nature, and people can't afford them. So we're seeing this in the round. There's a bigger issue. And at the same time, we've seen no-fault evictions go up by 113% in the last year. We're seeing people who are being moved as soon as they ask for anything. There's no decent living home standard for the private rental sector. And where we are currently in the nation's capital, it is extortionately expensive to rent, and it prices people out, and people are having to live much, much, much further out, or they can't move out from their parents' homes. So all of this is devastating, and there's no real plan. There's a lot of talk, but actually what we need is what Lisa and Andy did announce yesterday. But we need to know who landlords are, where they are, what the quality of accommodation is, and then support to make sure that we...
Many of the things which Lisa and Andy discussed yesterday are in the upcoming legislation that the government is planning. Lisa and Andy did rule out rent controls, which would be something which would make an instant difference.
But it's not a magic bullet, because what we'd see then is people pull out of the market because they can't afford to pay the mortgages that have gone up because we've had 13 increases in interest rates in the last 18 months. And that does affect, and buy-to-let mortgage rates are higher than domestic mortgage rates. So it won't be a magic bullet. We've got to look at these things in the round about how we can support. We need, candidly, and I don't know how many times we've all discussed this, but we need more social housing, and we need more physical properties available to rent to bring down the demand.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you agree with Lisa on the rent controls, but of course you've got a mayor in London, a Labour mayor in London, who wants rent controls. You have Tulip Siddiq, who's an MP, who's a shadow Treasury Minister, who also wants rent controls. So I think it's a good example of where the Labour are very good of carping on the sides, but nail them down to policy, and you can't even get the Labour cabinet to agree.
I'm really sorry, but the Labour cabinet, as you just said, in fairness, you just said the Labour shadow cabinet member ruled it out yesterday. We're in the process of determining what we can have in our next manifesto. And candidly, you are leaving us potentially with such a mess of things to fix that what we had wanted to do 18 months ago, we might not be able to do in
Carolyn, I'd just like to go back to Carolyn and say, we heard Ruth there talking about more support for landlords. One thing we have seen is the tax credits that used to be available for buy-to-let landlords. Those have kind of been phased out since 2010. Would something like tax credits help people in your position, Carolyn? Would that encourage more private landlords to stay in the business?
I don't think any one measure is going to be the answer to the difficulties landlords face. Those landlords with big mortgage increases, yes, the tax reduction that they were allowed to claim against a tax a number of years ago is now really biting because interest rates have gone up so much. But there is a plethora of other things weighing down on landlords, including rising costs. I yesterday bought a can of paint for one property I'm doing up. It cost me £57. That same can a couple of years ago cost me £29. Absolutely every cost that landlords are bearing has gone up. I've recently got a new HMO licence. The last one was £640. This one cost me £1,100.
OK, Carolyn Uphill, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate that. That is all for today, I'm afraid. Joe Coburn will be back next week with Politics Live at the earlier time of 9:45 because of Wimbledon. Bye-bye.